begin our scientific programme, and I'm really delighted to kick off the conference with a keynote presentation from Professor Darren Smith of Loughborough University. So Darren is a professor of geography at Loughborough and has been there for a number of years now. And his research examines the connections between changing places, both urban and rural, and particularly the process of change that come from migration of one form or another, with interest particularly in housing, in families, and in social cohesion and conflict. Darren is perhaps most well known outside his close community for the notion, the concept of studentification and the terminology around that, which he developed in the 1990s, really as spearheading research which focused on changes to urban and rural areas as a result of higher education populations, particularly the migration of those populations. But his interest in that kind of population change, which we might think of as gentrification, extend beyond studentification and indeed beyond the UK to many international contexts. Darren is currently the editor of 3 journals. I'm not quite sure how he has the time to do that. The Geographical Journal, the Journal of Rural Studies, and the journal Population, Space and Place. He's visiting professor at Hunan University in China, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and chair of the International Geographical Union, the IGU Population Commission. Darren was previously chair of the Royal Geographical Society with Institute of British Geographers Population Geography Research Group. And it's through that research group that I've been fortunate enough to work very closely with Darren. And one of his great attributes, which we all and the Academy benefits from, is that he brings people together. He emphasises this as a real part of his scholarly role. And in doing this, he encourages conversations and collaborations, and particularly what Darren is good at and has really helped us all with over the years is blurring the boundaries, the interdisciplinary boundaries and other boundaries and divisions that characterise academic work. He's an inclusive colleague, and I know that many of us appreciate that very much. So one example of Darren's work which speaks across boundaries is a population geography research group project that he led in 2015, and that I collaborated with him with a number of people, including some people in this room, which resulted in a conference and in this book, which some of you may know. And what I particularly feel glad about in this book and the project that Darren led is that this has contributions about migration from people across the sub-disciplines of geography. A really good example of how Darren brings together people with differing perspectives. A second example, which has already been mentioned, of Darren's contribution in bringing people together is his launching of this conference, the International Conference on Migration and Mobilities. Launching it, conceptualising it, and indeed hosting the first one, which took place in Loughborough in 2016. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Professor Darren Smith to speak to us today on A Perfect Storm, the tidal wave of post-pandemic internal migration.
Thanks for the warm introduction, Nissa. And just to reiterate my thanks to the conference team for organising this conference. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful to be back together again. This is my first conference since COVID, and I think we get so much more out of meeting in person, so it's wonderful. A Perfect Storm. Relevant title given what's happening in the political world, I think. Today. I've put out there a tidal wave of post-pandemic internal migration. So what I'm interested in today is talking about some ideas about how we might rethink internal migration in the UK context, and that might then travel to other different national contexts, and perhaps we can pick up on some of those points with the questions later. Oops. So 5 key aims that I'd like to push forward. I want to be a little bit provocative. I'm doing that on purpose to try and stimulate some discussion, and I want to be hopefully thought-provoking, get to think about some of the ways in which internal migration in a post-pandemic context is changing. I also, of course, want to illuminate some of the central themes of the conference that are clearly embedded in the conference, looking at the programme and some of the papers. I'd like to hopefully inspire some reflection, some rethinking about internal migration, how we conceptualise it, how we theorise it, how we research it. And then I want to argue that I think there's some fantastic, exciting opportunities, particularly for population geographers doing research on internal migration, to hook up and engage with other strands of geography and other strands of the social sciences, and I'll end on that point later. And of course, key to get some interesting questions, and as ever, hopefully this evening we'll be able to explore those in a bit more detail in some different venues, as it were, to this venue. So, we're currently in the twilight zone. It happens every decade after we get the census in the UK. There's a number of folks, the faces I'm looking at in the audience. I can see the anticipation that the census data is coming. We've had a little taste of it already. But I think it's a really important time for scholars of internal migration who are waiting for that data pipeline to come through, to start to think creatively, think outside the box in terms of what might we find when the data comes along, the census data comes along. Some absent friends there who are obviously not at the conference today, but are with us in spirit. Nissa alluded to the project. Amazingly, Nissa, it's probably 10 years ago to the day that we met in a small pub around the corner from Euston Station after a population geography research group, and I think we dreamt up the idea of the project. Nissa, Keith Al-Thakri, Nigel Walton and myself. And I think at the time, importantly, I remember that discussion we had, and it was about British society becoming more mobile. That was the thinking for the book. There was the media, the academic literature that was coming out was talking about people moving more frequently and more significantly in that particular time period. And of course, we were then waiting for the 2011 census data to come out. The book finally saw fruition after a few years of nudging and the conference, Britain on the Move conference. I think what's really telling from the book is a foreword that was written by Tony Champion and Tony Fielding. And they were looking back on their previous book that was one of the inspirations for doing the project. And they talked about, they wrote their book post a time when they were waiting for the census data to come through. So there's clearly some kind of train of history to what's going on in terms of rethinking, using that space to rethink internal migration processes and patterns. However, we were quickly proven wrong about this idea about Britain on the move and a more mobile society. There's clearly been a post-2011 narrative of internal migration, and we could argue 2011 is a suitable timeline. But there's now a mass body of scholarship, really rich, fantastic scholarship, which is in a sense, I think, was stimulated by Tom Cook's study of declining internal migration in the US, Tony Fielding and Ian Shuttleworth in a recent introduction to a special issue on the topic in Population, Space and Place, make that exact point. But Tony's Champion's book with Ian and Tom has been published, and there's an whole suite of works which evidences the declining rates of internal migration in particular national contexts. In the UK, an exemplar of that is the work of Nick Lomax and John Stilwell, who talk about and describe declining waves of counter-urbanisation. So reduced numbers of groups moving from the urban to the rural context. My own work with Martin Phillips at Leicester University involved empirical household surveys in a number of rural villages, and what we found in those rural villages is where ageing gentrifiers, people who'd moved in the 80s and 90s, were staying put, they weren't moving, and they were blocking the pipeline for future waves of internal migrants into those villages. So in a sense, we kind of reproduce some of the ideas that Tony Champion, Tom Cook, Ian Shuttle and so on have identified. In the recent introduction to the special issue, Tony and Ian question the significance of the COVID pandemic for internal migration, and they put a call out for scholars to rethink the effects and the significance of the last 2 years of the pandemic on internal migration flows. And I'm taking that today as a kind of an inspiration, a stimulus to talk about some ongoing research that I'm undertaking in South Nottingham. So I'll come on to that in a second. So, let me be provocative, let me stir up some emotions and some thoughts. I would contend that we're in a perfect storm at the moment. I think we have a number of cross-cutting, intersecting conditions, changing conditions, particularly in British society, that is perhaps going to be the launch pad or the platform for higher number of flows of internal migration within the UK context. And the three biggies, if you like, are Brexit, COVID, and let's call it the politics of housing. I'm not sure what the Prime Minister's doing there on that image, but let's call it the politics of housing and this kind of incessant push for new build housing and in a kind of a deregulated planning framework. But a word of caution, of course, because I know you will say this to me. It's okay saying there's going to be increasing waves of internal migration, but there's lots of constraints on the horizon, which might actually dampen the ability and the capacity of individuals, families and households to move around the UK. So we've got cost of living crisis, we know all these headlines, inflation, high interest rates, issues about access to mortgage finance, job insecurity, possible recession, we've got the uncertainties tied to the Ukraine war and so on. So all those factors might actually impede internal migration. We just have to see how those factors play out. So let's look at the effects of Brexit and let's think about some of the ways in which that might influence or impact internal migration flows in the UK context. Well, I think one of the things that we've not done very well within migration studies, with internal migration, is we've not really decoupled or unpicked the relations between international and internal migration. So international migrants, immigrants, come into a country and they don't stay put, they often move around countries. And Brexit might really be an important factor here in that. So, you know, we know about the return of the EU nationals to Europe. There's some numbers there. I won't go into that detail. And there's a number of commentators, a number of scholars who are arguing that we're now in the UK experiencing kind of new immigration regimes, new international migration regimes as a result of Brexit, which in a sense might have a bearing on subsequent internal migration flows. Perhaps those international migrants might have different residential, locational predilections, decision-making processes and so on, which might be different. At the same time, we're seeing, according to, again, a number of commentators, a lack of data and lack of evidence here, but we're seeing lots of stories, narratives in the national media about expats returning to the UK from Spain, Italy and Europe. And we're seeing stuff about a reduction or a decline in British nationals moving to Spain in retirement or pre-retirement or of course earlier in the life courses. And of course that begs the question, if these social groups stop moving to Europe, what are they going to do? Is there an alternative kind of residential locational trajectory for them? Will they move, will they relocate internally within the UK? Will they go to the kind of typical retirement hotspots of the South Coast and the South West, Cornwall, Devon and so on? Or will we see a rise, an increase in second homes or Airbnbs, holiday lets? Will that have an impact? So we need to rethink some of these changing conditions and consider how they're going to impact on subsequent internal migration flows. Then, of course, we add COVID. And you probably can't see that complex image down at the bottom, but that's the specifics of the lockdown and the measures that were undertaken in the UK context. And you could argue, and I'm sure the data will show this out, that actually the lockdown and the measures acted as a dam for internal migration. It stopped, it relatively, more or less stopped, people stopped moving, house sales to some extent completely stopped during the lockdown. So my question would be, was there a kind of growing pressure, a pent-up demand for all these households and all these individuals who were expecting to move but couldn't move during lockdown? And are we now going to see that pressure be released? Are we going to see a flowing of internal migration around the UK context? Perhaps we're seeing it now. Perhaps it's happening now. Perhaps people who didn't move during the pandemic are now rushing out and moving to different parts of the UK. And of course, the census data perhaps is not going to pick that up. So we're going to need to try and find new data sets, different sources of evidence to explore that issue. Now, this is an image from the book that Nissa presented. And this was the fruits of many hours discussion with Keith, Nigel, Nissa and myself, trying to create a conceptual map of internal migration within the UK context. What I would suggest is that we now need to sit down and rethink this. I think the world has changed dramatically since we scripted this in 2013, whenever it was. We scripted it. I think we could all use to sit down and think about a new conceptual map of internal migration. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because I think the typical triggers of internal migration are changing. Or I think the influence of these triggers of internal migration are changing. So just something I've just put a few down. Education, going away to university, leaving the parental home, going to a different region to study at a university or college is changing. Partnership forming. There's lots of stuff out there in the media, lots of policy makers writing about these changing rates of cohabitation and marriage in the UK, the decline of marriage in the UK. Child rearing. Lots, again, commentators talking about child rearing, family forming is undergoing profound transformations. Moving into school catchments. Moving into school catchments to get access to so-called better education for children is changing. Divorce reunification, widow, mature aging. I could go on with lots of these life course events that we know often trigger internal migration or international migration. So let me give you an example of a recent piece of research I've done with university accommodation officers in the UK context. And the simple question I was asking them was, have things changed as a result of COVID? As the student population changed, as their demand for accommodation, for particular types and forms of accommodation and particular locations, has it changed as a result of COVID? And the unanimous answer I got back from them was profound changes, dramatic changes. We're having to change our business plans. We're having to change our services. We're having to change our provision. And what they're arguing is that students increasingly do not want accommodation and housing in multiple occupation, small shared housing. They want purpose-built student accommodation. And the reasons for this are the loneliness that they've experienced during COVID. They want more people around them. They want a bigger access to social groups. Anxiety and mental health has become a much more significant issue. And crucially, parental involvement in their accommodation decision-making processes has become significant. Parents are telling their offspring where they're going to live when they go to university. Very different to a decade earlier, I'd suggest. Safety, security. So what students now are seeking are hotel-like accommodation with a concierge and security on the door and 24-hour services. They want spaces for social interaction. Within these purpose-built student accommodation blocks, they want a space where they can interact with other students. They don't have to go to the local cafe or the pub. It's on tap. And crucially, they want spaces where they can undertake online learning. So that's the big change, one of the big changes of COVID. They don't want to be sat in the room in the house, in the shared house. They want to be able to go into a space where they can interact with others and learn online. And of course, one of the key things for many of them is cost of energy, issues of sustainability, and so on. PBSA is seen as more sustainable. So we've had this huge growth in purpose-built student accommodation. We've got these changing geographies of studentification unfolding across most cities in the UK as a result of these business plans. And that will influence the internal migration flows of students. Students will be going to different parts of towns and cities and moving into different forms of housing stock. Changing life course. There's lots, I could throw lots of these at you. The media's full of them. Effects of lockdown, birth rates in the UK. Brilliant piece in the conversation by Ian Burrington and Joanne Ellison on this. Saying that, yeah, birth rates are changing, but we're not quite sure where it's going. We need to keep our eye on this one. Divorce rates, widowhood. We've got lots of stuff coming out saying that these rates are changing. The dynamics are changing. And there's been quite a significant period of reflection for many households during COVID. Many households have reconsidered what's important to them. They've had an opportunity to ponder and reflect and contemplate. Work-life balances have been addressed, rethought through. And that then has a bearing on locational and residential preferences. So we've come up with this triad of post-pandemic rural gentrification for some research I'm doing Martin Phillips at Leicester on rural gentrification. What this is doing is it's saying we've got increased home working, and as a result of that, we've got increased demand from particular social groups, affluent social groups, for rural and coastal locations. Because of working at home, people no longer need to be fixed to their workplace. They can live long distances from their workplace. Don't need to be in the urban, you can be in the rural or the coastal settlement, going 2 days a week and so on. And we've also, crucially, got this increased demand for larger internal and external space. If you're spending longer in your domestic spaces, you want bigger spaces. So some families are trading off. In a sense, the downsizing in terms of property to upsize in terms of location and space. Again, this is going to impact on these internal migration flows. One of the key things I think we've understated within studies of internal migration is the supply of new build housing to some extent. Now, of course, this is one factor in many factors. But what I see when I visit towns and cities post-COVID is high levels of development. Places are changing dramatically. There's this kind of acceleration of new build housing. On the train up to St Andrews, I passed Grantham, and I saw this new build spilling out of Grantham over the fields, literally spilling out into across this landscape. Dramatic change. If you live in Grantham, that must feel like a dramatic change to you. But all that new house building means people are moving in. It's migration, a form of internal migration. And of course, our Prime Minister has the motto, build, build, build. Fully committed to building 300,000 houses a year. Now, he might not meet that target, or the government might not meet that target, but there's this drive, this push, which in some towns and cities and some places is being realised, of course in others, it's not being realised, and there's a really important geography to this, which I'll come on to in a second. But alongside this is this deregulation of the planning system, the removal of the red tape, to allow this development to go ahead in a less hindered way. And I'll give an example in a second where I think that's going. So this is the new build housing, additional dwellings. There's very little demolition currently, so we're more or less talking about new build here. And we can see the curve coming out of the recession going up and then dipping again in as a result of the COVID pandemic. Perhaps if we project into the future, we'll see that line go back up, start to rise. So let me give you some images. So thank you to Loughborough University. I've had a year's sabbatical fellowship, and one of the things I've been able to do is get deep into a city. I'm really interested to try and understand what's going on post-pandemic. And I've been able to spend a lot of time in South Nottingham because it's a landscape that has changed quite dramatically over the last 24 months. You can see the concrete, it's observable. It's unfolding before my eyes. One of the reasons for doing this is huge inspiration from a work in the late 60s by a sociologist called Ruth Glass, who coined the term gentrification. This is how I've got into this kind of work. But she does a fantastic description of urban change in London in the 60s and describes the kind of the holistic change that's taking place in London from the inner core to the suburbs. So I'm taking inspiration from that. What I'm seeing in Nottingham now, South Nottingham, are some clear drivers of internal migration. Really strong drivers that are pushing and pulling different social groups across the city. And I'm going to talk about these for the next 5 minutes. Suburban sprawl is staggering. The scale of the suburban sprawl in Nottingham South is staggering. The densification of the suburbs taking place. The suburban super gentrification, I'll call it that, and I'll explain why in a second. We've got processes of reurbanisation, so we've got social groups moving back into the centre of Nottingham. Studentification, which I'll come on to in new parts of Nottingham. And then we've got counter-urbanisation and rural gentrification on the fringes of Nottingham taking place. So you could take a transect through Nottingham from the centre out to the villages, and you would see all these processes, which is this kind of chaotic flux of people moving into these new developments, and of course moving out. There's issues of social justice and displacement here that we need to consider, social inequalities. So, a map. What I'm particularly interested in is a place called Edwalton, which is in the south of Nottingham, is a suburb. You can see the scale of the development that's happening now at Edwalton. It's all this kind of area down here, and you can see Edwalton south of West Bridgeford, which I'll talk to in a second, and the River Trent going east to west, west to east in there. So what's happened at Edwalton? Edwalton is it was rural. I suspect it would have social and cultural meaning as being a rural place for many of its residents. The fields at Edwalton have just literally over the last 2 years been developed through these kind of blueprints of new estate suburban development. So 1,500 houses built in Edwalton, 8 phases. You can see the different phases. And you can see on the left the kind of landscape, the kind of change, the transformation that's taken place from being an area of rurality, of fields, to then being kind of transformed by these new house building developments. So Edwalton Fields, name Edwalton Fields, is a wonderful example of, I think, of what's happening in a vast majority of British towns and cities, particularly in the English context. Sprawling. Build is leading to these sprawling housing estates on the edges of British towns and cities. The key driver of internal migration. And there's other important factors that's driving this. So for example, one of the key factors is education for children. So Ed Walton, as an outstanding secondary school, what the developers have done, quite cleverly, is built a primary school as a feeder to that secondary school. So the vast majority of the social groups moving in to Ed Walton are affluent families with children. Now, of course, we could question, is this a form of gentrification? Probably not, because no social groups are being displaced. But again, we could argue with it. And you can see, it's all about migration. Improve with the move. Improve with the move. Now, the developers in the interview said that the migrants coming in are moving in from the region. They're moving in from other parts of Nottingham, they're moving in from Derby, and they're moving in from Leicester. So there's some interesting internal migration flows at work here, which is shifting around the populations, the affluent populations. And of course, the process has been triggered. What we're now seeing is the acceleration, the intensification of these processes. So the landowners around the site are now selling off their land for development. The sprawl is sprawling and sprawling and sprawling. So there's two examples here. 8 exclusive contemporary homes, planning permission given, 9 contemporary homes, planning permission given. So we get this huge suburban sprawl, this huge, these high flows of internal migration taking place. Alongside that, in Ed Walton, we're seeing a densification of the suburbs. So this is one exemplar, just to show you, there's multiple examples I could have given you. So what we've got on this slide is a property, a detached property with a large garden that was probably built in the 60s or 70s. So what happened, phase 1, was this bit of the garden got sold off to a developer. This large property, currently on the market for £2.5 million, gets built. And then, subsequently, the garden to that property is now being sold off as a building plot. So, on one household space, you're going to have 3 households. Densification of the suburbs. I'm moving in towards the river now. I'm moving through the suburbs. I'm in West Bridgeford. So, notorious connotations of gentrification, where the middle class of Nottingham live. What we're seeing now is a super gentrification of the suburbs of West Bridgeford. A super gentrification. So these are the typical suburban landscapes. We're now seeing developers moving in. Well, we're seeing households moving in, purchasing the gentrified properties, and then upgrading them through these kind of grand design builders, architects, and so on. Numerous examples across West Bridgeford, which again I could show you on these houses. So we've got this new group moving in that's transforming, reconfiguring the suburban landscapes of Nottingham. And then I'm going to go further out. I'm going to go back out now. I'm going to go out to the rural sticks of Colston Bassett, home of Stilton cheese. And what we're seeing here is a form of super gentrification. This place was gentrified in the 80s and 90s. The gentrifiers are now being displaced from Colston Bassett. They're now being displaced, and you can see the large plots in the hall of the Colston Bassett Hall, its grounds. And we shouldn't lose sight here. There's key people, there's key actors, there's key agents driving a lot of these processes. So this chap here, Guy Phoenix, property developer, is key to a lot of the developments in West Bridgeford and Colston Bassett. And these are the kind of things that's happening. This is the Knoll, which sold for $775k in 2010. It was purchased by an affluent immigrant who decided to knock down the property and then rebuild this modern, super gentrified, grand designs again, property on the side. $3.5 million, that one. Tanglewood. So you can see all the kind of the nature and the tree metaphors here going on. Tanglewood. 4.8 million. And then we've got infill developments. So this densification of the village taking place. Suddenly land becomes prized in these places. 3 million for a new development there. So the rural, the suburbs, the sprawling suburbs are all changing in South Nottingham. This is all post-pandemic. And then we come on back to the students, studentification. So this is a map produced by Knight Frank in their student housing market report from 2019-20 or 2021, I can't remember the year. Identifying the location of purpose-built student accommodation blocks in Nottingham. And what you can see here is that the students in Nottingham are increasingly going into the centre of Nottingham, living in purpose-built student accommodation. But they're also being pulled towards West Bridgford, in the kind of declining central urban areas. And there's lots of media rhetoric and media narrative on this. 7,000 student beds in PBSA required in Nottingham. Nottingham is the largest pipeline of PBSA in the UK. But it's not just Nottingham, as this map shows. Purpose-built student accommodation blocks are becoming the dominant form of student accommodation in the UK. It's affecting many towns and cities, which is going to change the migration flows of students. And remember, students often move on an annual basis. Alongside the students in Nottingham are the young professionals. So again, we've seen lots of new developments, these high-density, large, exclusive blocks in Nottingham. So we've got a process of reurbanisation taking place. Trentbridge Quays and Saffron Court. So Saffron Court is sold as a development for professionals. And the champion that some of their residents are professional football players and professional cricketers and doctors. So the PBSA is student-only space. We've kind of now got professional-only space being produced and manufactured. And alongside that, reurbanisation process is a new purpose-built student accommodation blocks. So this is huge, the Vantage. The Vantage. Interestingly sold for the future generation, above the door for the future generation. So what does this mean for the other segments of the housing market? Well, I would argue, and I predict, that what we're going to see is a significant change in the private rented sector. So historically, in Nottingham, places like Lenton have been oriented towards students as the residents. What we're now starting to see, and we've seen it elsewhere in cities like Leeds, is the student market being replaced by the professional market. So the student lets move over to the professional lets. And I suspect that's what we're going to see in Nottingham. And the private rented sector is really important in the UK context, because we know it's increased dramatically over the last 20 years. The growth has kind of stabilised now, but over the last 20 years it's increased dramatically. And we know it's really important for understanding internal migration, because the populations that tend to live in housing in multiple occupation and private rented sector tend to be transient populations that move in and move out, often on an annual or biannual cycle. So really important we recognise that. So let me give you some analysis of some data. So this is preliminary. It's the my attempt at getting to grips with some of the 2021 census data that just appeared over the last few weeks, and I guess I'm kind of getting myself primed for the fuller census data release and for the migration statistics data that comes out. But I just want to play around and be creative here and explore some hypotheses, which kind of hinge off that back of that stuff, that research I'm undertaking in Nottingham. So let me suggest provocatively that an increase in total number of households, so I'm going to be looking at household growth, not population growth in the next few graphs, is tied to relatively high numbers of internal migration. Now, of course, I'm being simplistic here. We know that household growth, there's lots of other factors that report it. But let's just go with this for the time being. Let's argue that internal migration is tied to relatively high levels of new house building. So in places where there's lots of new house building, we'll see lots of internal migration. People will move into the new house, which will free up housing, and so on, and the domino effect happens. And then lower increases in the total number of households tied to low levels of new build housing and internal migration. So what's the opposite? What's the counter of that? So let me show you six quick graphs because I'm conscious of time. So this is local authorities in England and Wales that's experienced an increase in the total number of households of 10% or more between 2011 and 2021. Was that the wind, David?
Yeah, I think so.
Never heard wind like that before. Okay, so what we're seeing? So we're seeing the local authorities divided into regions, and the colour coding is the ONS supergroup classification, the 884 classification. And these are the places that have got relatively high household growth in them. And I think something interesting is going on here. So London surprised me. Only 4 districts in London. I know Tony Champion's written about population growth recently in London. He might have something to say on this later. But clearly there's something going on in the southeast of England and the east of England. So those orange colours are the affluent England, areas categorised as affluent England. And then something seems to be interesting in the East Midlands, the North West and the South West. So we've got the countryside living and the town and country. So particular types of local authority in particular regions seem to be witnessing household growth in those areas. So, my question is that to do with new build housing? Is it to do with internal migration? What's driving this household growth in these places? And equally, we've got some interesting kind of oddities in there, haven't we? We've got the urban settlements. So we seem to have some urban settlements that are experiencing household growth, and they're the places I would expect to see on this map, having experience of those places. So the Bedfords, the Peterboroughs, the Milton Keynes, the Dartfords, the Salfords, the Rugbys, and so on. Those places have lots of new build housing on the edge of them, which is really interesting. Let's look at the other side of the coin now. Let's look at the local authorities with an increase in total number of households of less than 3%, so the bottom of the league table, if you like. And again, very different, very, very different. So I think 2 things might be going on here. So if we look at the right-hand side, we've got lots of declining urban settlements, places that have got a long list here, but a history of socio-economic decline and poverty. So Blackburn, Bolton, Hyndburn, Pendle, Rochdale, Trafford, and so on. But on the other side, we've got lots of yellow. We've got the business, education and heritage centres. I think what might be going on here is an undercount of the student population as a result of the census being undertaken and influenced by the lockdown. I think that's what's going on. I think the students have been undercounted. The students have gone back to the parental homes. So I think that's what's going on there. So Brighton, Oxford, Portsmouth and so on. Liverpool. And then we've also got that services and legacy category that's coming up there of declining places. So the Chesterfield, the Hartlepool, the Sunderlands. That's probably not surprising. We perhaps wouldn't expect lots of internal migration into these declining places. Or is it because there's no new build housing taking place? We'll have a look in a second. So then when we look at total additional dwellings, so again, these are arbitrary. I could cut into the cake at different points. These are arbitrary. But total additional dwellings, so where a local authority has recorded more than 9,000 new additional dwellings between the period 2011 to 2020. So I've aggregated the annual things up. Again, when you look at, so this is the n equals, these are the total cases, and we'd probably expect them to be highest in the big metropolitan urban areas. Perhaps we would, perhaps not. But we can see that London now starts to dominate for new build, and we can see less low numbers in the south, east and east. But again, those affluent England categories coming out, and then we can see lots of dark green and light green again in the other regions. So some pattern seems to be merging here with new build housing. And then when we again look on the other side, at the bottom of the league tables, if you like, we see the naughty children, if you like, the ones that are experiencing low levels of new build. So there could be a number of things, of course, going on here, couldn't there? It could be, the greens, the kind of the more prized rural countryside living and the town and country places might be actually resisting new build. They might have very powerful social groups. NIMBYism might be kind of institutionalised in these places, and they might be very well scripted at opposing developments, perhaps. Or equally, there might, some of these places might be protected by national parks and SSIs and so on. But equally, on the left-hand side, we can see some interesting parts of the southeast, for example, Hastings and Gravesham with low new build totals. So some interesting questions going on. Then, final two, I'm nearly done. Local authorities with, so this is an index I've done, MBTD. I'll tell you what it stands for. New build to total dwellings. So basically what I'm suggesting here is what's the percentage of the housing stock that's been built since 2010? That's right, isn't it? Yeah, since 2010, 2011. And this is a percentage. And I've done this because I'm interested in this. I'm also interested in the social and cultural meaning of internal migration. So if you're in a big place like London and you've got lots of new build, it might not affect you. It might not affect your perceptions of change, your perceptions of transformation. But if you live in a small place and there's a large housing estate built in, you might think that migration is a big issue, a key factor in your quality of life. So we can see here that the local authorities with 10% or above, so 10% of the housing stock has been built in the last 10 years. Again, I think there's some interesting stuff coming out here to explore further. In London, we can see again all these affluent places in the south east and the east, which might map on to those household growth areas that I mentioned earlier. And then again, the greens, the dark greens and light greens coming out in the southwest and the East Midlands. Those local authorities with less than 5%, with below 5%, so the bottom lot, similar names coming out again. Hastings, Calderdale. We can go through them. I could map them onto one another. So clearly here we've got urban settlements in the northwest, in Yorkshire and the East Midlands that have got low levels of new build housing. So that's a flavour of some 2021 census data. Let me conclude, because I've got 50 seconds left. Go to my stopwatch. I'm going to conclude by travelling back in time, because I think this is a really interesting quote for us to think about. So I've slightly tried to be provocative. I've been oversimplistic. I've done it on purpose, because I want to reflect and rethink about how internal migration may have changed as a result of the pandemic or post-pandemic. And what I've tried to suggest is that a place like Nottingham has undergone these profound changes, and the drivers of internal migration are gentrification, a studentification, a counter-urbanisation, a densification, a suburbanisation. Lots of work that's getting done out there by non-population geographers, by scholars in political geography, in economic geography, in social and cultural geography, historical geography. And I guess my question is, are we effectively engaging with those different branches of geography? I mean, we could cast the net wider and say sociology. Are we engaging with sociologists? And if we did engage more effectively with those groups, would that inform our thinking about this population change that I've described? Would it be helpful? And 1995, I think this was in the second edition. I'm looking at Mark here, Mark Ellis. I think this was in the second edition of International Journal of Population Geography. And Paul White and Peter Jackson said that population geography has become separated from other branches of human geography. That's a long time ago. 3 years in the future, we'll be looking back and wow, that's an anniversary. So my question I'm going to pose and end with is, as population geographers, if we really want to get to grips with these changing geographies of internal migration, do we need to engage with the other branches of the academy, of the discipline, in more effective ways? Thank you.